Good morning to all of you. I am Valérie Lemarquand, attachée for science and higher education at the French Embassy in Sweden, which means that I am in charge of the relationships between France and Sweden in these fields. I am delighted to welcome you and thank you for being with us today to talk about the so-called Cotutelle PhDs. And without further delay, I have the pleasure and the honor to give the floor to Etienne de Gonville, Ambassador of France in Sweden.
Good morning. My name is Etienne de Gonville. I'm the Ambassador of France to Sweden, and welcome to this seminar. I am extremely pleased to be here with you this morning to open this discussion. As you may know, between France and Sweden, we have a strategic partnership on innovation and green solutions. This text has been signed by President Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Le Pen back in 2017. It has been updated in 2019, and it frames the development of our bilateral relationship and the goals we have for the relation between France and Sweden. And we have great ambitions for this relationship based on the assessment that there is a lot of potential in the bilateral relationship, but that has not been tapped. That there is a lot of things that we could do better. That there are a lot of tools that we could develop to make sure that we work better together. We take advantage of the different specializations of both countries, the knowledge, the scientific basis of both countries, and that we have to move forward. That relationship between France and Sweden, although we have great ambitions, although we think there is a lot of untapped potential, that relationship is not natural. We are not natural partners. We do not have, we're not used to working with one another, even if I could be able to quote a lot of successful stories of accomplishments of the bilateral relationship. There is obviously a lot of effort to put in the relation if we want to make it more intimate, more trustful, and if we want to make sure that our academics, our students, our industries work, and our universities, of course, work better together and have as a self-evident hypothesis the willingness to work together. So the discussion you're going to have today is indeed about just that, about the kind of efforts we can put in the relationship, the kind of new tools we can develop to make sure that France and Sweden, two recognized poles in Europe of innovation, science, technology, competence, are able to enhance their mutual knowledge, their mutual contribution to science, and ultimately their mutual prosperity. So this seen from my role as an ambassador, this is the kind of goal I expect out of this seminar this morning. Making progress on those new tools that will help unleash the potential between our countries. Double degree programs leading to Cotutelle PhDs are this kind of tool. These are not easy tools. It's not easy between France and Sweden, but it's not easy with any of our partners in Europe. But my understanding is that they are extremely fruitful when they are successful, and they are really worth the effort. I hope the discussion today will help you frame these new tools and get a better understanding of what needs to be done for France and Sweden in this domain. We are helped, of course, with the new frameworks that emerge as we exit the pandemic. The European Universities Initiative is going to materialize much more now that freedom of movement will be hopefully easier within Europe, and will help us develop what we want to do between France and Sweden. I would like to thank, before you start the discussion, Hans Adolfsson, Vice Chair of the Association of Swedish Higher Education Institutions, Marjorie Berthomier, Deputy Secretary General of the French-German University, Carle Bonafous-Murat, Permanent Delegate of the Conference of University Presidents in Brussels, Raymond Pfeifel, Professor of Physics of the University of Göteborg, Mathieu Gabory, postdoctoral researcher with a double PhD degree from KTH, and Beatrice Svedberg, future competence strategist at Scania. And of course, the team of the embassy, Valérie, Lauriane, and Christopher, who have organized this meeting today. Thank you all for your mobilization. Again, the goal you set for yourselves this morning requires some effort, but I wish you a very fruitful and successful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. And now, before getting to the heart of the matter, it may be useful to give, first of all, a definition of a Cotutelle PhD. This means that during the doctoral programs, the students involved prepare a double degree between two institutions of two countries. The doctoral students carry out their work with two supervisors, one from each institution, and after the thesis defense, they graduate with two doctoral degrees, one of each university. Thus, Cotutelle agreements encourage the mobility of doctoral students between two countries, France and Sweden in our case, and boost the scientific cooperation of the research teams involved. The event today is a part of a broader approach, both at bilateral and European level. Indeed, the topic has been recently addressed in events between France and other EU countries, such as Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The seminar this morning will be divided into two parts: challenges and issues of a Cotutelle between France and Sweden, and then Cotutelle, an added value for all. The first part will focus on the concept and on the varied problems that faculties, administrative staff, researchers, professors, and doctoral students are faced with when setting up a double PhD program between a French and a Swedish higher education institution. We are very pleased to welcome our panelists for this part of the event, Hans Adolfsson, Marjorie Berthomier, and Carle Bonafous-Murat. They will present their points of view and discuss them. You can ask, of course, questions. To do so, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will relay them to the panelists and they will give you some answers after their presentation. For now, I had the floor long enough and I give it to Hans Adolfsson, Vice Chair of the Association of Swedish Higher Education Institutions and Vice Chancellor of Umeå University. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to come here and participate in this webinar today. I think the topic is very relevant. How can we develop stronger bonds in between Sweden and France in terms of internationalization regarding research collaborations? And I think that's really something that we can for sure build stronger bonds on. And the topic of today's seminar, the Cotutelle or the double degree programs for PhD students, is of course one way, just as the ambassador mentioned in his opening speech, is one of the tools that we have in order to establish stronger bonds in between our countries. Just to tell you a few words about the Association of Swedish Higher Education Institutions, or the Swedish Rector Conference, that is normally called when we talk about it in international terms. We are 38 higher education institutions who are members of the Swedish Rector Conference. And what we do within that Rector Conference, we often set up small working groups working on specific issues that is for the common of all the higher education institutions. And we often end up by getting to recommendations for the different universities in order for them to work along, let's say, common lines, so to say. Okay, and then let's go into the topic of today, international collaboration. International collaboration has always been very high on the Swedish agenda, especially for the Swedish higher education institutions. And that refers, of course, both to education and research. And I will just give you an example on how the Swedish and French relationship has been very successful in recent time. And I'm not only the vice chair of the Swedish Rector Conference, but I'm also the vice chancellor of Umeå University. And we are, of course, extremely happy with last year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was given to Emmanuelle Charpentier, which really shows the strong connection we have in between Sweden and France. And Emmanuelle, she was recruited to Umeå University for a chair within one of our institutes here at the university, and she did her breakthrough here in Umeå, and we are of course extremely delighted about that. So international collaboration really shows that it pays off, and if we can sort of combine our resources in a good manner, then that we for sure can get good outputs of that as well. So how do we do these collaborations? Well, most of the time I would say that these are bottom-up approaches. So there are individual researchers that find connections throughout the world who they want to collaborate with on specific topics. And if that is successful, it can lead also to some bilateral agreements in between the universities or in between the different institutions there where the researchers are working on. And that's sort of the normal way we do. And that refers both to research and to education, because often a research collaboration will lead also to an educational agreement. And most of Swedish universities, they do have a number of these international agreements with universities all around the world. And I think at Umeå we have about 1,000 different agreements with different universities scattered through the whole world. The total number of PhD students in the Swedish system is currently around 17,000, so 17,000. The number of students taking a double degree is very, very hard to figure out, because I don't think there are probably statistics about it, but I didn't really find any specific number for that. So that tells me also that this is not a very common way of doing a PhD. And mostly, I think it's due to some legal and systemic issues that occurs. And I mean, that's one of the challenges that we do have here. Whenever we are using a double degree program for PhD students, then it's always, I would say, on the individual basis. It's not systemized in any sense that we have that on agreement so far. And there have been some investigations on that as well, but I don't think they ever came to a recommendation that was good enough to actually pull through all the way. So let me talk a little bit about the Swedish PhD system, because I think that deserves to set on the stage as well. And when Sweden joined in, as most of Europe did, on the Bologna Agreement a number of years ago, it was said that according to the Bologna system, we would have a 3+2+3 model for education, a total of 8 years. That is 3 years for a bachelor, 2 years for a master, and then the PhD would be an additional 3 years, so a total of 8 years. However, in Sweden, we stayed actually at the longer PhDs at that time. So a typical Swedish PhD education is 4 years or 48 months of studies. And often it's actually longer, because most PhD students, they do a combination of their PhD studies along with they are also doing some teaching. So most of the time it's adding up to 5 years. The PhD education these days is much more formalized than it used to be in the past, and that refers both to recruitments being more professional now than it used to be. I mean, in previous years, if you were a good student coming up to a professor, you would most often be asked to join in as a PhD student if you were interested about that. Nowadays, we are doing this much more professionalized and doing full announcement for PhD positions and so on. And the PhD positions right now, or the PhD students, they are employed at the university. So they don't, well, we have a very few number that are receiving fellowships or scholarships, but most of them, I must say, the absolute majority are employed by the universities. So that could be a challenge as well if we look into how can we do this combination, because you are supposed to be hired by the university. All the different subjects that you can take as a PhD student, they do have a general study plan, and that is specific for each subject. And then on top of that, every single PhD student also have an individual study plan that is followed up annually from the supervisors, and that's something that we are required by law in order to do that. So that could also be something that we need to work out if we want to do a successful double degree. I mean, how to handle these things. And unfortunately, I think at every Swedish university, when I went through the web pages, I could see that all of them, they do have very thorough checklists for how to set up agreements in order to do double degree examination or double degree PhDs. And I guess then a number of these challenges that do come up is something that I already mentioned, the funding, for instance, but then we have a couple of other things as well. For instance, the examination, how to do the examination at two different stages, or how to get that approved by two different institutions. The way the theses are combined and made in France and Sweden, I think differs quite a lot, because in Sweden it's very common that we have a thesis as a combination of a number of research papers, and then you just add a summary of the papers on top of that. Whereas I know that a monograph is much more common in a number of other countries. We also, of course, have the issue of language problems. I mean, or being Swedish, I would say most Swedish, they do know English and they know how to speak English, but I don't think French is their top priority language, unfortunately, I must say. But I think that for some students, of course, that will work out as well. So I think I pointed out a number of challenges that we do see in order to really have a successful collaboration in that sense. But of course, we also need to mention a few advantages. And that is, of course, the scientific experience by being in two different scientific environments. I think that is something which is really, really good. And in fact, most Swedish PhD students, they do get the opportunity to go to another university throughout their PhD studies when they're employed here in Sweden. So I think having that kind of exchange is something that do work out very nicely. Of course, the employability, and I think we will hear more about that in the second topic, or in the second part of this webinar, when we also hear from both a postdoctoral researcher who has a double degree and then a professor who is experienced with supervising a double degree program. That could be interesting to listen into as well. But I guess employability is for sure one of the advantages. And then, of course, the development for the individual of a number of soft skills that you would get by working in two different culture settlements. I think that is really something that could be a strong advantage for the individual in that sense. And then looking into the future, just as Ambassador de Gonville said in his opening speech, I think the European University Initiative can act in that sense in a manner to overcome some of these challenges, and we will look very positive into the future. So I think I'll stop there and leave the floors for the others. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hans, for all this information. We know we have very clear idea now about the Swedish systems, and there are great inputs. And I now give straight away the floor to Marjorie, Deputy Secretary General at the French German University.
Thank you very much, Valérie, and thank you, Professor Alexson, for the listing of the problems and issues you can face with if you want to make cotutelle, so-called in French, so-called cotutelle agreements or cooperation on a double degree program for PhD students. I tried to share my little presentation with you. I maybe as a tradition, I would present the Franco-German University and maybe explain why we are here and maybe why we have been invited here, which is a great pleasure for me to be there. The Franco-German University is a network of affiliated universities from France, Germany, and other countries. And also we have our head office in Saarbrücken, at the border between France and Germany. We are very aware and interested in expanding to a European level, and our universities or the higher education institutions who are working with us and with the help and fundings of the Franco-German University are involved in many of the European alliances of universities which have been located through by the Mr. Ambassador. The Franco-German University was established as an international institution following an intergovernmental agreement. That's to say, we are a binational institution, and we had, or we should follow the aim to provide expert guidance on relations between French and German higher education institutions, with the aim to improve cooperation within study programs and research in both countries. And maybe a characteristic of our work is that we are working on integrated programs. And as you can maybe see by the, hopefully see by the figures on the slide, we are working with many students involved in the integrated programs at the bachelor and master degree, at master level, and we are working too at the doctorate level, at the PhD level, and within the, I think, 14 years where the Franco-German University has funded PhD double degree. We have now 470 doctors who has made a double degree program, and has called double doctor, if you want to say so. We have the Cotutelle de thèse, these double degree doctorate PhD program are taken within a frame where we are not only trying to cooperate or make the universities cooperate within license and master, but also take place in funding programs or different funding programs for junior researchers. And for us, it is very important that the Cotutelle de thèse, the individual double degree PhD program fundings can take place within a PhD track or in graduate schools. That's to say, in programs structuring the cooperation between the higher education institution, as well as structuring the education from the young researcher or the future researcher too. Cotutelle thesis is a franco or binational cotutelle PhD, which system allows doctoral students to write their dissertation under the supervision of at least one professor in Germany and one another in France. And but this is not only a double supervision system. Doctoral students are awarded a doctoral degree from both institutions after defending their doctoral thesis in one of the two of the both institutions, of course, but with all the possibly all the problems or the eventually issues that Hans Adolfsson mentioned, and we made for years, for about 7 years, I think, a first survey on how the doctorate or the double doctors were integrated job markets, and we could ensure we made aware that it was on the first point a good, very good and good thing to make a double degree, because of the soft skills and of the hard skills you can award within this process, and that allows the students to getting more employable, specifically maybe in the private sector, but maybe it's a point we can discuss or can be discussed in the second panel. The second results of our survey was that the double doctorate students said to us, it's a great thing, but it's a huge administrative effort to be done, so that from the identification of the subject to the negotiation with the supervisors, to get the subject being accepted, and then to get an agreement. And for 3 or 4 years, we ordered qualitative inquiry through the Franco-German Institute of Ludwigsburg to better identify the issues and the problems and the administrative problems our students or PhD students would have to face with. And we worked with our scientific council on agreement frame and a checklist about the different points or elements which have been, or questions and issues which have been to be solved to make it more easily. Maybe these are the elements that you and I've already spoken, and this is not such difference between France and Germany as it would be between France and Sweden, I guess. Because the funding issue is a very important one. The examination issues are very important ones. That's the agreement and the structure of the thesis itself is approved by the both institutions, can be very difficult too. In Germany, you have a federal structure, and you have in France the framework conditions for doctoral studies are set by the Ministère de l'Enseignement Supérieur, de la Recherche et de l'Innovation. That's to say at a national level. But in Germany, you can have different agreements and different regulations at each faculty, and it doesn't make it very, very easy to have or to build such an agreement. But it is possible, and it is possible because in recent years, the Ministry of Enseignement Supérieur in France has revised the national framework governing the right to confer PhDs through the publication of a decree, a very important decree if you want to make cotutelle with France, which in the first 19 sections sets out the modalities for the awarding of national PhD degrees to ensure comparability across all universities in France. But in the section 20, however, of this arrêté du 25 May 2016, this section 20 states that the universities may permit exceptions in order to make allowance for binational cotutelle de thèse. And this is a very, very helpful regulation because it makes possible all the things, all the to implement the solutions to all the problems you can or you could figure out that the PhD students would be confronted with, from the duration of the dissertation, from the modalities of study and examination, or from the nature of the supervision, and of course from the selection and appointment of the assessors. So I would say maybe if Sweden wants to use, or Franco-Sweden corporations want to use these checklists, we will put it, I think, tomorrow or in the next days on the our website, which will be in English and goes online in English in a few days too. And that could be possibility to enhance and develop, I think, the cooperations between the higher education institutions. Maybe for the very last word before I give the floor back to Valerie, I wanted to say, for me, I think it's there are three issues remaining after that we have solved the administrative difficulties or problems of the students, and these three topics, I think, or three challenges are very important and maybe critical, could be critical in the next year as well for the Franco-Sweden cooperations, maybe as well as for the Franco-German cooperations. And these three issues are, in my opinion, the pandemic, which we have seen has made specifically difficult for the PhD students to remain mobile and to maintain the mobility between the different countries. The second issue you talked about it, Professor Adolfsson, is the language, because not all the theses have to be done in English, and it is a problem which it is a problem if we just have to speak or to research in English, even if we are not in the means, if our students not all are researching in the means disciplines, and this is a problem which has to be solved with, I think, plurilingualism and teaching of different languages, and that's not a very easy issue. And the third, I wouldn't say problem, but challenge is, and you mentioned it as well as Mr. Ambassador, is dealing, and this is a very great project of the European universities, but you can figure, and I think all the panelists would figure what the challenge it could be, even if you have solved the problem between France and Germany, or between France and Sweden, how it could be if you have a third country, or more than 3 countries. Okay, I would finish here and give back the floor to Valerie, and thank you for your attention. And I stop and unshare the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie, for this information, and straight away I'm giving the floor to Carl.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to be as quick as possible. Some of the things I wanted to say have already been said. I wanted to start with a few figures, but I'm not going to give the facts and figures which are general. I'll share those figures which were issued yesterday. So that's top news indeed. Apparently, out of about slightly less than 30,000 PhD students, 7% of them are joint PhD students, and 40% of them have a European co-supervisor, that is compared with co-supervisors from other continents, such as the Americas, African countries, and so on and so forth. So that's obviously the highest rate. But it appears that, of course, and this was mentioned by Mrs. Berthonier a few minutes ago, because of the pandemic, there was a downslide in the number of first-year enrollments in Cotutelle by 17%, and this affected European collaborations only to the extent that 16% of the students, of first-year students, compared with the previous year, did not enroll. So the question which I'd like to raise, but we don't have time perhaps to answer this one straight away, but are we bound to have shorter range mobility, at least in the years to come? Is this something that we have to consider? Is this something also that we have to consider because of the necessity of taking into account the digital and the green transition in particular? It is not to mean that we should cut ourselves off from the other continents, not far from it, of course, but this may be one of the consequences of what has been taking place. And I may also, I'd like also to remind our colleagues that you can, of course, start co-supervision, a joint PhD, but that you may also wish to get a European doctorate label, label européen, which is not exactly the same thing as a joint PhD. It doesn't have the same advantages, and that's why if I move on to my second slide or my next slide, I wanted to list some of the assets of a joint PhD. Professor Adolfsson has already mentioned some of them. For instance, the change of scientific environment, the existence of two supervisors from the candidate's home and the host institutions, the training program in both universities. I'd like, and this as a kind of anticipation of my next slide, I'd like to point out two things which seem to be of great importance. One of them is the high quality research projects with global impact. I think PhD, joint PhDs should aim at having a global impact. Of course, they may be very specialized, they may bear on one specific topic, and we've seen in the list of questions raised by some of the people attending that some are looking for very specific partnerships. But I think this global impact should be perhaps one of our aims in the future. And also one of the other advantages is that, well, this is a degree which is officially recognized in each of the partner countries, and therefore it may have an impact on employability, which, as Professor Adolfsson has pointed out, I believe is also one of the main aims of a joint PhD. And I'd like to point out in that respect that only a few years ago, that was in 2019, the doctorate became, so to speak, enshrined in the RNCP, that is what we call the French repository for professional skills. That's a rough translation. And I think that this RNCP shows that there may be 2 or 3 aims which we should pursue by establishing joint PhDs. That's what I would call the 3 I's, you know, thinking of European co-funds program, for instance, internationalization, intersectoral and interdisciplinary mobility. Of course, you can do one or the other. You do not necessarily have to pursue the 3 objectives at the same time, but I think that Cotutelle offers you the possibility of you know, aiming at the 3 objectives at once, and that is why it may have a real international impact. To go into detail for a brief while, RNCP divides the skills that a joint or a doctorate, not a joint necessarily, but a doctorate brings you into 3 building blocks, which I've tried to divide into 2 kinds of categories. The specialized skills on the one hand, that is a doctoral student learns to design and develop a research and development process, learns how to implement it, and also learns how to valorize and transfer the results of that process. And there are more general skills which are no less important, such as learning how to improve your skills in international science and technology watch, the training and dissemination of scientific and technical culture. And I think this idea of culture is also an important one. And the management of teams dedicated to research and development activities, what we call l'animation de la recherche in French, which I think is also an important issue. So I think this list of skills, no matter how general or abstract they may seem to be, is interesting in order for future PhD students and joint PhD students to know what they should aim at by, or what they could aim at by joining a French university and a Swedish one. I would also like to say a word about joint PhDs in the private sector. We have a system in France which is called CIFRE, which roughly translates as Industrial Agreement of Training Through Research. And it's a contract between the PhD candidate, one laboratory, and one research and development company. So it's a 3, sorry. going back to the previous slide. It's a three-pronged contract. It's not often it's not often very well known in businesses, but I think it's certainly something that might be used in our future relationships between Sweden and France. Of course, these implies that the doctoral student will develop multilingual and multicultural skills, but again, perhaps one of the main aims should be that it would allow the doctoral student to find work on the labor market of the other country. That is a very European perspective, but I think this is one we should favor. So that's why I'm asking whether we should try and aim for a broad and technical communication as to what CIFRES, or a more discipline-based communication, or a more a communication geared towards the specificities of the labor market. Perhaps all three would be the natural answer. And last but not least, some people have already mentioned the importance of the European Universities Initiative, which was launched by the European Commission in 2018. I just went through some of the alliances websites to check which ones had already developed a kind of joint PhD program, and some have. But what is interesting is that some have developed a kind of multilateral approach. And I'm thinking of Utopia. I noticed that there is a representative of CY among the list of attendees. I think, unless I'm mistaken, that it's a more general approach. That is, there is no specific thematic orientation to the program. I may be wrong. Whereas checking the website of another alliance, which recently got selected by the European Connection, that's ECTU, with the University of Poitiers and the University of Turku in Finland. I noticed that they launched a bilateral agreement, in cell biology. So that's very specific. That's very thematic in a way. But I think the European Universities Initiative will be a test bed for developing new solutions and for testing new solutions to some of the issues that were raised by Hans Adolfsson during his presentation. So that's all on my side. And of course, I'll be pleased to answer questions with all three, with all the other two participants in this panel.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you to the three of you. Maybe before we open the floor to the question, if you have some remarks or a question, one to each other, before we go on. No, well, nothing further. Well, I see there are quite a lot of questions, so I would suggest we go to this and start straight away with this part of the discussion. One of the questions is, do you think that it will be possible to manage the difference of duration of the thesis between France and Sweden from the payment point of view? There are some answers given privately, but maybe I think it would be interesting to tell what we can imagine. Which one of you would like to answer this question?
Well, perhaps I have an additional question related to this one. What happens, Hans, if you, in Sweden, you do your PhD in 3 years instead of 4? Is that a problem in the end, or I mean, is that just a possibility which is given to all doctoral students?
Well, it is a possibility, I must say, Carl, and the time the PhD student is hired for is in fact 4 years. So if you finish earlier, that is usually not a problem if you just fulfill the criteria for the PhD, of course. And If you then are finishing earlier than that, then you normally would be staying at the university for the additional year. So let's say you would finish in 3 years, then you would still be hired for the 4 years, and then you would have, well, basically the possibility of doing like a postdoc at that university.
Okay, well, that would not be bad. Well, we understand, because the question may be from the French point of view, there is sometimes some pressure from the doctoral schools or programs. So, and do you think that for well, I should say average PhD student, this could be possible to end it in 3 years? Because that's maybe the issue too.
I would say that that is not the case. Just looking on statistics, I know that most PhD students, they will stay for longer. They will not finish in 3 years. We have a few exceptions doing that, of course. For perhaps if they already get a good start in their master program, for instance, with their diploma work, if that is something that they can include also in the PhD, then it is of course possible. But if not, then I would say it's very difficult. But as someone mentioned in the chat as well, that I saw that, of course, the finding of a good financing system for the individual PhD students is a challenge as well. And we have a number of different systems. We do get money directly from the government, and which we can and are allowed to use for PhD funding at the university level. But we often rely and have to rely on external funding as well. And that is something that will always have to be taken into consideration.
Okay, because this is one of the main issues, and there are well, several questions about this and how expenses may be shared between both universities. Well, I think it should be possible. Do you have some experience, Carl or Hans or Marjorie?
Yeah, I think, pardon, Carl, I think you at the Franco-German University, we provide possibility for the students to get the amount of money to go, but this is only money for the mobility and not a ground basement financing system. But we allow also to the PhD students to get some money from other parts. And I saw in the chat that Jan Putz, for example, from the University of Strasbourg, mentioned that the European MSc programs with French partners are foreseen for 4 years, and that would be possible, I think, to combine some different financing. But of course, this is a big issue, and of course, it has to be accepted and consented and concerted.
Okay, thanks.
What about registration fees in Sweden at doctoral level? How high are they? I mean, this is an issue we haven't discussed, I believe.
No, exactly. We haven't mentioned that, and maybe I took that for granted. Since all the PhD students in Sweden are hired, there are no tuition fees whatsoever. So PhD students then are employed by the university in that sense, and no tuition fees. And especially, I mean, if we look upon a French-Swedish relationship and a French-Swedish program, then we will both be within the European Union, so that will be absolutely not a problem. So, so no fees. But what about that situation in France? Is that an issue?
It's an issue for students who haven't got a working contract, because not all of them have. Of course, registration fees are not very high in France. I mean, what they are, but it might become an issue, yes, for some of the students. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
registration fees can be regulated to within the agreement between the two universities, I think. But that is to say, and I find it very very good question, because it points out that you can't make a PhD double degree or joint program or joint agreement without a very positive taking part in engagement from the universities, I think.
Yeah, and that leads us to another question, which is maybe blunt, but I ask it: do all universities in Sweden allow cotutelle PhD on the administrative level? Because well, it's often a very large amount of work. So what is the position? Can it be refused?
I must admit that I can't answer that question, because I don't simply know whether all institutions in Sweden are allowing PhD students to go into a cotutelle agreement. But just as the questioner pointed out as well, I mean, there is, of course, an administrative burden on setting up an agreement. But as I also mentioned in my opening talk, then most university has a very good checklist for how to do this, and also have already sort of formatted contracts and agreement protocols in order to do this. So I think it shouldn't be so much of a problem. And of course, we can learn from each other and use each other's knowledge on that. So it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Martha.
No, pardon, Karen.
I just wanted to say that also one of the questions that should be taken into account, and one of the pieces of advice I would give to students wanting to start a joint PhD is to, I mean, that's part of the administration's job, of course, but is to make sure that the requirements for the defense are compatible, or that they are not too different. I mean, some have discovered at the very last minute that, you know, your supervisor couldn't attend the jury, or on the contrary, that all the jury members had to come from another university. These are questions which should be addressed very rapidly, and certainly not before the defense itself.
I wanted to say that's an issue for sure, because you have to, or the people who wants, the researchers who want to agree about PhD students should really exchange about and speak about very precisely about the assessor and about the evaluation, and about this assessment, and how and who can be attending at the defense. And we saw at the Franco-German University that in some universities they make two defenses, so in order to make sure that the two regulations could be enough, good enough for the students, and that's maybe not the best way to solve the problem. But what I want to say is the administrative staff. I think for the administrative staff, it is the cotutelle or the PhD, double PhD, joint PhD can be an help to internationalize the administrative staff too. And that's to say, okay, lifelong learning, we should also think about it. And at the Franco-German University, we are thinking about organizing a webinar for the administrative staff to better, so in order to give them the knowledge how to deal with these specific difficulties, issues.
Okay. Well, there is one more question about the tuition fees, and the fact that the question of if a French partner could, under national regulations, waive the tuition fees, or if it has to be part of an agreement. But I think you already almost answered that question. This has to be part of the agreement. A further question about the systems. If the Swedish supervisor is a professor, is it required for one of the French supervisors to have an HDR, so habilitation to supervise in France? I think we should make that clear.
I'm not sure that's an obligation. I wouldn't say so.
No.
Okay.
I would say that, well, I think it depends. I think it depends which institution you're at. Okay,
so we have a part answer and we'll have to check afterwards. Maybe something about the CIF and industrial PhDs. There are lots of discussion between the chat and the questions. Of course, we will speak about it in the second part, but there are lots of interest in them, in the technical and engineering part, but also in the humanities. Could you maybe give us some more information about this topic? I know that I guess that there are international CIF and that there are possible too.
Some of them can be with any country in the world. Others can be with European countries. So that's a possibility. It's part of the agreement and discussion in the first place, you know. Well, there are, of course, visa conditions, working conditions, and possibility of staying on afterwards. But that's a possibility, yes. And in the humanities sector, as someone said in the chat box, of course, there are sectors in which there was a figure of 25% SSH CIF given by someone in chat box. I know, coming from an arts and humanities university, that there are sectors which are more prone to having CIF than others. For instance, I'm thinking of the sector related to the cultural industry, creative and cultural industries, as they are called. It's easier to have a CIF in that sector than, say, in a literature. With a literature PhD. I mean, just no judgment on my part. It's just a fact.
Yes.
Maybe I could just add our experience, and is that I would think within a CIF we have to pay a particular attention to the intellectual property and to the patents and to the rights of users, because it can be very difficult if you don't have solved this question before.
Yeah, maybe one last precision about that, because you spoke of the ICC. The question is, are art high school art schools or art universities in Sweden prone to have PhD students?
Yes, they do. They do have PhD students also at the university with arts within their disciplines. For instance, we do here in Umeå. We have an institute for arts, for fine arts, and that has PhD students. Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess we could go on a bit further, but as time is passing, I propose you to have a short coffee break and to come back in 5 minutes for the second part, and we'll have time afterwards for general discussions and to answer questions that haven't been answered yet. So thank you to you all, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you later.
So thank you for staying with us and joining us. And for the second part, we will now discuss the pros and cons, but especially the added value of Cotutelle, both for a career in research and in the private sector. So we are pleased now to welcome our panelists, Raymond Faithful, Mathieu Gabory, and Beatrice Swedberg. I will directly give the floor to Raymond Faithful, professor in physics at the University of Gothenburg. Raymond, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Valerie, for your kind introduction. So I will tell you a little bit about an experience which I gained during 2015 and 2019 with one student. You see here is basically the front page of the doctoral thesis, which we achieved during those 4 years. Dimitris is his name. That was basically, that student was supervised by myself and a colleague at Sorbonne, Dr. Marc Simon. And the whole thing, actually, there is a history, of course, to it. And it was not something which we had planned on right from the beginning on. It's more like that, first of all, the French supervisor and myself, we knew each other for more than 15 years, and we were from the same field. We developed alternative techniques for doing a certain type of experiment. One was developed during my time as a postdoc at Oxford, and then we transferred it eventually to Sweden and Gothenburg, and he worked on his technique in Paris. And after a while, it turned out that it's the usual story. Each technique has its strengths and its weaknesses. So we thought it's a good idea to learn from each other. And it turned out that basically his technique could do one specific aspect very good. So I was invited, and then we started to collaborate a bit more closely. And I realized that that could actually be the theme for a doctoral thesis. And at the same time, I had a former master's student who worked with me who wanted to do a PhD, and I felt like he would be the right person to go in this sort of onto this topic, and also who probably has the right sort of, let's say, he would be the right person to do a double degree, to be in 2 countries. He is originally from Greece, so he already felt like he's very international anyway. So the advantages were very clear. We could make use of each other's expertise for the specific scientific problem we wanted to investigate. And we could strengthen our collaborative efforts between the different groups involved in that. And my issue was I had basically the money for a full PhD position in Sweden, but I had also more than one candidate whom I wanted to hire. So actually I realized by doing this double degree arrangement with France and then also actually with another university in Finland, I could get basically 2 PhD students onto my team, but then the 2 students would be shared with 2 other universities. And this is how it worked out at the end. It's of course a bit of work, and the advantages were quite clear. I mean, we would be exposing now, in this case, Dimitris to both the French and the Swedish environment, so a truly international environment right from the start, and he really liked that. He would at the same time get acquainted with 2 different academic systems. He would get 2 doctoral degrees. That was perhaps not really what he was aiming for from the beginning on when he discussed things with me, but nevertheless, he thought it's a great idea. Of course, he would experience different cultures, and he would. I think one of the big advantages is also really having the possibility to build his future in different countries, in particular in France and in Sweden. both within academia and industry. At the moment, he's doing a postdoc in the US. So, I mean, I really think he will probably remain with academia as things look right now. But there were also, of course, challenges, right? I mean, it's not so straightforward. This is not a standard sort of thing we do. And some of those challenges were already addressed a number of times. A PhD in France, normally it takes 3 years, whereas in Sweden, we say 4 years of research time, or it's actually, if you're honest, it's also just 3 years of research time, because the students are supposed to take a number of graduate courses, which corresponds to what we call the 60 högskolepoäng. And then on top of this, there can come institutional duties like teaching, but this is more something if the student wants to do it. We of course encourage our students to do that, but not all the students, they do it, okay? The big difference was on the economical side and also how you enroll the PhD students. In Sweden, we do this now these days, I think solely by employing them properly, so proper positions, which means also that it costs quite a bit more than when I was a PhD student. I was enrolled on a scholarship to begin with, it was quite cheap. I haven't really understood the French sort of reimbursement system for graduate students, but it reminded me a little bit about the situation which I had when I started. It was more perhaps like, let's say, a scholarship scheme. Another issue, which is very often forgotten, is actually the housing issue. If you are supposed to do your PhD in 2 countries, how do you deal with the housing? And I mean, the idea is, of course, that the student or the candidate's supposed to be, let's say, in Sweden for a number of months, and then in this case it was Paris for a number of months. How do you deal with the housing? Can you as a student afford to have 2 apartments in parallel? That is one thing which wasn't so clear either to myself and my colleague in France, but we solved it eventually. Another challenge was, of course, this is a bit more related to, perhaps it's a bit more related to this, how the Swedish law system works. Who can actually legally pay for costs associated with traveling between the 2 sites, because formally the students is actually going back and forth to official working places, if you want to put it this way. The type of visas was mentioned. French is more onto monographs, whereas we here in Sweden, we like to have the collection of scientific papers plus a summary. We could get a fairly easy agreement on that one. It, of course, took a little while to discuss that, but we found a nice solution. And then there is the thesis examination, of course, according to the French and the Swedish system. One can perhaps come up with a hybrid solution. And I can tell you maybe a little bit more about what we did at the end. What I really found hard to begin with was getting professional administrative help in sorting out a double degree contract. Of course, there are people in principle in charge of that, in our case in Gothenburg on the faculty level, but it turned out that they weren't so experienced with it. So, I mean, there was a learning process, let's put it this way. I would say, if I can give some advices in doing it, is first of all, start on time in making such an arrangement, because it will take time. It's not a quick fix. In our case, it took at least 6 months, if I remember it correctly. And then when I talked to other colleagues, they thought that was actually quick. I would say it's quite important and also beneficial if the 2 supervisors who are interested in setting up a double degree arrangement, if they can act as sort of gently, gently pushing diplomats in respect to the administration process. Because there is a learning process on both ends, at least that was how it was in our case. Then I would say be open-minded, try to understand the 2 systems. It's a give and take. What we did at the end is we always had the perspective of the candidate as the driving force, and we tried to pick the best aspects from the 2 academic systems. And this is also related to my last point, is that the candidate is actually the one who is in a particularly vulnerable situation. One should keep this in mind. And I think if one has basically the student perspective all the way, then that is a good thing. I would say it is something which is extraordinary. I definitely think it's worth the effort, and it's great if it works out well for all parties involved. But it's quite a bit of hand-on work all the way. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Raymond, for the way you put things, and your set very optimistic lights on the issues, and I think that's great. But now I would like to give the word to Mathieu Gabory, which is a postdoctoral researcher with a double PhD degree at KTH. Mathieu, the floor is yours.
I'm just sharing the screen. Should work now. Can you guys hear me correctly? Can you hear me, or is it not working at all?
Yeah, it's perfect. It's working. We can hear you.
Good.
Everyone can hear you.
Excellent. So, so the student point of view for Cotutelle is a bit different. We have a lot of points in common, though. So about me, I'm currently a postdoc at Cotu in Stockholm, Cotu Center for Vehicle Design in KTH, and I did my bachelor and master in Le Mans, and I decided to do an internship in Stockholm, and then I did a PhD basically between the two. And there is the question of this fourth year that that we have in Sweden but don't have in France, and in our case we solved it by calling me a research engineer for 1 year basically. The challenges of the Cotutelle are quite many. The one that everybody talked about is the fact that there are 3 years in France and 4 years in Sweden, plus 60 credits to take, plus a licentiate and some mandatory lecture. And what we saw from the student point of view is that it is most of the time possible on the French side to discuss with the doctoral school and agree for like all of the requirements. So only 50 hours of lecture instead of 100 in the school where I was, for instance, and reduce the number of mandatory assignments, for instance, the English ones. Of course, if you're living abroad, your English will get better. It's a bit harder in Sweden, and it's definitely something that should be discussed right in the agreement, if possible, or at least between the two supervisors and the student. Most of the rules can be adapted beforehand, but rarely while you have started the PhD Cotutelle. So you need to figure it out before you hit the wall, because when you actually hit it, it's really, really hard to navigate through administrative hurdles. And once again, that's what was said before, but the student should be kept in mind. Indeed, a PhD is always kind of a weird moment for a student, but a PhD in Cotutelle between two countries, two labs, and two culture is really strange of a moment. So when in doubt, just follow what the student would be doing. There is the question of moving, and several people have talked about it. So what we said in the beginning of my Cotutelle was, well, what about spending September to March in France and the rest in Sweden? Meaning that sounded like an amazing idea. I mean, it's synced with the academic year, meaning that I can teach in France. It allows to have a lot of fresh starts. When you move to a new country, you get new ideas and you meet new people, and it's usually quite refreshing in a PhD. And I didn't get to freeze because no winters in Sweden. Well, that was the most terrible idea of this whole thing. There is a yearly accommodation nightmare. So I decided to keep my flat in France for a very good reason. It was rather cheap. I was not in Paris. I was in Le Mans. It's cheap there. And to change flat in Sweden. But finding a flat every year in Stockholm is something that I wish to no one. It's extremely difficult to settle in when you move every 6 months. And we did the mistake of writing in the convention the periods where I should be in France and the periods where I should be in Sweden, which is something that I would advise not to do. and let it flow depending on what the requirements at the specific moment in the PhD are. There is a lot of opportunities and a lot of gains at being a Cotutelle student there. There is basically 4 points that I'm going to try to discuss shortly. And the first one is this visiting and settling thing. You can, as a PhD student or as a researcher later, visit a lot of labs, but settling in a lab and trying to be part of this lab as a student and not only as a visitor is a lot better. You get to discover a lot more how the culture works and how different labs work different ways and how people interact in different manners in different countries. So it sounds extremely simple, but for someone that starts in research and that is in his first like 3 or 4 years, this is extremely important because it teaches you that not all labs work the same and not all things will work as well in each lab. You also get to grow your network as a researcher much faster because you visit, if you start with 2 labs, quite quickly you want to visit the 3rd one, and then it's quite easy because you already have all these things set up. There is 2 teams and different ways to interact at different scales. So for reference, my lab in Sweden was about 40-50 persons, and the one in France about 200. So the way you interact at these 2 scales is completely different, and you get to figure out a lot of things with this. There is also the fact that working in 2 teams is a hiring asset. You get a double degree, you get 2 different teams, and then suddenly a lot more people know your name and know who you are. So when you're actually looking for a postdoc, it becomes easier. There is the obvious language boost. I mean, if you're working in English for half your time, of course, and actually more than half your time because all your meetings with your supervisors are in English, this makes a huge difference in the long run. Particularly, and this is very, very true for French students that are usually not that good in English because we're not that we're not taught, but we're not really interested in this language in the beginning. But suddenly, as you're working with an international team by default, then you get to know English a lot more, much better and much faster as well. And then there is a lot of funding. So funding is, as a Cotutelle student, is an amazing thing. You get, as you are in 2 universities, 2 countries, in different communities, then you basically can apply for funding to conferences and visits on each side. Meaning that if you really want to, and this was my case, you can visit quite a large number of institutions during your PhD and try to blend in researchers from different backgrounds. Meaning that you suddenly get to see what the research world is as if you were not just a very, very young Padawan researcher trying to figure out his PhD only. So this is something that I would stress to all advisors and PhD students that want to try this. The whole funding and the possibilities of traveling that a Cotutelle PhD offers you is something that is invaluable. To wrap up, so the bottom line is Cotutelle are amazing. They are glorious because you can do so much different things and you get perspective that you will never get before like 10 or 15 years in research after your PhD otherwise. But they need to be well planned. It's not something that can be done on the fly, and it's something that you really need to put in writing. It takes a few needs, though. There is a few things that are needed. First, the co-directors of the Cotutelle must be extremely present or ready to be extremely present because there's going to be administrative and personal hurdles on the way. You need to make sure that the admin staff at each university is aware of what a Cotutelle is. Else they will probably discover it when the problem arises, and this is a lot too late. And they need to be responsive. We had the chance of having one extremely responsive and one very responsive one as well. So it came out pretty nicely. The only thing is that they would not discuss together. So everything was passing through us, which is fine if you're aware that this is going to be the case. The third thing that you really need is plenty of humor. You will end up in situations that you were not expecting, that you find ridiculous because you have two sets of rules that just collide and that you can't work your way around it. One of the thing that happens is when you choose the defense committee, because when you have to go for the French rules, which is parity in the sense of the section, and then the Swedish rules, so nobody that your directors have collaborated with in the last 5 years, plus this and that, and then it becomes a mess. And there you need humor. You also need to figure out what you want to do as a final work. If you prefer a thesis, an article, or a monograph, but this is almost a non-question compared to choosing the committee and figuring out all the rules on how to apply. And there is a few questions to answer that you can take home and wonder about if you want to start a Cotutelle somewhere. What's the long-term target for the students? You need to discuss with the PhD or the potential PhD student to know what his target is. Does it require teaching if he wants to stay in academia, or working with an industrial partner if he prefers to go to industry at the end? This is stuff that you obviously make up on the way, but you still need to discuss about it in the beginning to know if you need to stress this or this part of it. You need to figure out if you can reduce the number of long-term location changes. Going in a country for 1 month is completely different as going for 6 months or for 1 year. These are three completely different things. And you need to figure out what makes sense for the work you're doing and what is okay for the student. There is the question of the salary that I think it was Catherine Fortunato that asked the question in the chat. Is the student salary enough to live in both cities? For most of the Cotutelle PhDs, they actually get only one salary on one side. And this, when you have a French salary living in Stockholm, keeping a flat in France, there is moments where you wonder if you're at the right point in your life. But this is something that can be answered, but you need to actually ask the question in the beginning. And finally, who should I contact for administrative issues in each side? And this you want to know and have a name and a phone number on it before you even start writing a convention. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mathieu, for this very interesting experience and all those tips. I think we'll discuss that a bit later, but I would like now to give the floor to Beatrice from Scania. She's a future competence strategist at the research office there and will give us the point of view of the company.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm trying to, so can you see the presentation? I cannot hear you.
We can see it, thanks. It was perfect before, just...
You could see it? Oh, sorry. Your screen is sharing, and so...
Yes, that's fine.
Good, thanks for inviting me. As you heard, my title is Future Competence Strategist at Scania, and I've been working with competence issues for the last 7 years at Scania, with a lot of cooperation with academia, but I've also been working a lot with recruitment. And it's been really interesting to listen to all these topics. I was not aware about the complicated side of this. So we'll just give you a short presentation, just so you know what Scania is, if you don't know. That we are making trucks and buses and engines and power solutions for, we've been doing this for more than 100 years, and we have had very good figures since 1934. We haven't had any red figures. So we are very wealthy company, I would say, with 16,000 employees in Sweden, in Stockholm, in Cotutelle, south of Stockholm, and we have 50,000 employees worldwide. Yes, but this is the past. In the future, our aim is to drive the shift towards sustainable transport system, and this is why we cooperate a lot with the academia, because we need to do a lot of research on new topics. and new technologies in order to achieve this goal. So it's not about, in the future, we don't see us as a truck or bus company. We are a transport solution company. So we're heading towards automation, connectivity, and electrification. There's our main goal there. That we have electrification has already started to really, it's getting fast in the electrification business. Also in the connectivity business is also going fast. Automation is going fast, but not as fast. Scania, we are owned by Volkswagen, and we are the third largest R&D center in the Volkswagen group, but we have a huge network of R&D sites in the world. So we have within Scania. So if you're like doing research together with Scania, you can also have the possibility to enter other Volkswagen facilities. So I just show you short the Scania technology roadmap. We have 7 areas that we would like to dig into, and that I want to emphasize here is that it's not just technology. I saw that you had other top universities as well attending, but we have this area we called human-machine interaction. There we have a lot of psychologists working with social behavior. We also have cooperation with what is called music university. It's probably not called like that, but the musical University of Stockholm, with making like how should the electrical vehicle sound, what should it be like, and what's a good sound for future designs of a truck, for example. We have research cooperation with these universities, and I have listed here. I will not go through this, but you can look in the presentation later on if you would like to cooperate with Scania, which university we have, what kind of technology area we work together with. But at Scania, we have 2 ways of becoming a PhD student. We have the industrial PhD students. They are employed by Scania. They have supervisors at Scania and the university. And those positions, they are posted on the Scania career website. And on the other hand, we have the academic PhD, and they are employed by the university. But they do research together with Scania, where they have a supervisor at the university, but it's in cooperation with Scania and according to our technology roadmap. And then you should apply, in this case, you should apply to the university career site. So we have these 2 different things, and we have about 4,000 engineers in Cotutelle, and 10% of them are have a PhD degree. So we really like PhD. And one of my former manager from Volkswagen, he said, you should only hire people that have changed postal code a minimum 5 times. So that's what we're looking for, that we have this, he told me that when Volkswagen was expanding to China, they had really big problems in finding people who could move to China, working there with their families, because when you're like 40, 50 years old, and if you never moved out of Wolfsburg, you've been living on the same street as your parents for the whole of your life. Maybe it's you're a manager, then it might be a very big step then to take to start exploring the world. So we encourage people to do it early and learn about new cultures, learn about also about like finding business opportunities. If you understand more of the world, we believe that we could find better business opportunities, understanding how things work, different regulations. And when it comes to this, when I've been listening, and I think it's really amazing with this, the broad network the students would get with doing the Cotutelle, or how you pronounce it. And also it's when Matt describes all the obstacles he's been sort of dealing with. I think that's something that's like a dream person to employ. If you just had to smooth, everything worked really well and you didn't have any problems, I don't think you develop so much as a person. So I think you shouldn't be afraid of these obstacles. It's a good way of learning. When we hire the PhDs, we want them to be like, we see them as managerial material and want them to be in center of like the development for the future. So then you need to be driven, self-motivated, and be able to find solutions on complicated tasks and so on. So if you manage this, I think it's perfect. But you cannot just apply for a job at Scania saying I've been in the Cotutelle system, because we wouldn't understand. You have to describe a little bit more about what it's about. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Beatrice, and thank you to the three of you. Maybe before opening the floor to the questions, you want to make some remarks between each others to what you said, or exchange some ideas, react?
I think it was all very complimentary, actually. So I'm very pleased to see that. That's what I can say. And I like the idea of exchanging at least 5 times the postal code. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, then I guess we can switch to the questions, because there are well, quite a lot of them, and there are also comments. Of course, the recurring problem or question is the length of the PhD, and it's also if I try to summarize the question, the way to prepare the things, and I think we go to Mathieu and what he said, but also to what Raymond said. The importance of planning everything and knowing each other, and when to start, because in France you can decide to switch to a PhD Cotutelle within the first year of your PhD, I think, which then could be far more complicated. Could you maybe give us some point of view from the Swedish side, Raymond?
So I mean, of course, it needs to be put in some sort of written form, this double degree arrangement. And quite early on, we had to decide who of the two, or which of the two universities should be the host. And I guess once you have decided that, then I think it follows quite naturally whether this PhD should be for 3 years or 4 years. So in our case, we've decided that Gothenburg would be the host, the primary host. And from that, it followed that we should we should give the student a length of 4 years. But then there was this aspect of doing teaching, which in principle could have extended the lifetime of the student by another year. But we had a discussion with the student, and I said, of course, if he wants to teach, we will arrange for that. But then he said, no, it's fine. I mean, he decided himself to not teach. But this is all a matter of discussion, I guess. But this is the way how we did it. And I don't think it was a very big issue, because I also understood that from the Paris side, I mean, there is the possibility to give some extension to the lifetime of a PhD student anyway. So I don't think that was extremely critical. It's of course an economical aspect, because the French system primarily wants to finance the students for 3 years, and in Sweden we're prepared to pay for the research time of the student for 4 years. So I mean, that has to be factored in how to deal with the economy there.
Maybe a point on this. In the French system, you need to go through some kind of discussion with external advisors as well at the end of the first year, second year. And at the end of the third year, if you plan to defend after the 31st of December of this year. So what we did for me, for instance, was to defend just before the 31st in the middle of the fourth year. Because afterwards, we would have had to go through something else and explain the Cotutelle again. So basically, we finished the PhD and we just kept going with the research we had on the line once the PhD was over, but still funded. So it's kind of a trick. The French system can be a bit tricky on this, and particularly there is something else. Since for a long time you could hire the PhD students you wanted, provided the lab liked it as well in France. Now you have some kind of a how to say. I'm looking for the word, but you need to apply for this PhD position, and you will be like auditioned and chosen afterwards. And for a Cotutelle, this does not really make sense because you want to work with a student you know will blend well in each lab. So the whole, if you work with a student that you have had as an intern before, it's usually a bit easier because the student has met you and has met the other advisors and has potentially worked with each other. And this gives you some help in blending the student in.
Hey. I see there is sort of a discussion going on in the question and answer section. But how I could sum it up is it's still about when to start and decide you make a Cotutelle and who will choose the student, because effectively you have many configuration and I guess you have to be practical. Sometimes the question will come from the students, sometimes it will come from one of the labs. The French one, maybe the Swedish one, and then the two supervisors, they have to agree on one student. Well, can you also give us some advice on this? You already said what I think was reasonable, but I think as an answer to that, there has to be a discussion, and maybe we should say that the supervisors have to know each other very well before they start doing this. Could you tell us what you experienced? Raymond or?
So, I mean, in our case, the case which I presented, I knew my colleague very well. I mean, he's a bit older than myself, but I bumped into him when I was a student. So, I mean, we knew each other quite well. There are different ways of doing it, and I also can see in the chat that someone is onto European funding for joint PhD. And there is funding schemes like this exist, and this is actually, that is my colleague at Oulu University in Finland who is exploring that. And then you start you start completely differently. You know, you submit a proposal to somewhere in Brussels. It's not a European Research Council, it's a different funding scheme, where you basically then ask for the funding for a certain number of PhD positions. What you do is, there are a number of different universities already involved, and in this case, Oulu was presented as being the host of all those. You promise a little contribution, a little economic contribution on the order of, I think, 30,000 euros. That is what, for instance, our university would contribute if this funding comes through, and the rest comes from the European Union somehow. This is a very interesting scheme. And then you start completely differently, because then if the money comes through, then you can announce those positions like this, right? And then the whole employment issue comes completely different. So in our case, we basically invented this double degree already at a time when I had announced the position, and I had two very strong candidates, but I only had the money for one. And I wanted to have basically both. And this is why I started to look into double degrees, one with Paris and the other one with Finland.
Yeah. Okay, I think at this point, all the panelists could join us, because the questions are getting more general. So please, Marjorie, Carl, and Hans, you can join and maybe give some more advices on the last topic and about what is available at the European level, and if we can dream of more.
I think Raymond was referring to the co-fund instrument that allows and that's an instrument that has been used by, for instance, Utopia, the European Universities Alliance, which we mentioned earlier on, and which has started offering 20 cotutelle or doctoral positions, though as someone pointed out, Utopia doesn't have any Swedish partner institution, but that is a tool which may be used very usefully by the European universities that have appeared since 2018.
And that scheme actually also, I think it requests even the involvement of industry, if I remember it correctly. So, I mean, that co-fund scheme, it wants to see not only academic partners to be involved in that, but also industrial partners, which I think is a very interesting scheme.
Yes, there's a greater emphasis on intersectoral mobility in the new co-fund program, since 2019, I think. Yeah.
Maybe we spoke about language issues, and we know that well, we can all speak English when doing some research, but there is a question that wasn't asked, and maybe I would like to ask it. It's the language in which you have to write the document, your thesis. Either it's collection of articles, and then I guess they can be in English, but what about the humanities sector? And what about in France, or when it's a monography? Can it all be in English, or should it be in French or in Swedish? Could you tell us a little bit about this, please?
I think, I mean, just to say a word about my experience at Sorbonne Nouvelle, you have to have the agreement of the doctoral school board in order to write your PhD in English, and that's never a problem. The only thing is that you're supposed to write a 40-page summary in French at the end or before you defend your thesis. It's a long one. I know that in some other universities it's a shorter one, so it might be a criteria by which to assess the accessibility of the French PhD. You know, how many pages in French do you have to write at the end?
And how is it in Sweden? Yes, Hans?
Well, normally the theses in Sweden are written in English. So that's sort of the most common language, I would say, because a lot of the work is done by collecting a number of articles that are already written in English, and then they are compiled into a thesis. And but if, for instance, as you pointed out in humanities, it might also be that some of the theses are written in Swedish. So that's the other option you have there. So, but this is, I would say, the typical way.
Okay. And there was also the issue you spoke of, how to fund the traveling costs, because you have the accommodation cost, the traveling costs. We've spoken of salary, but yes, yet there is still the fact that the two supervisors plus the student have to travel. So of course there are some tools, but can we dream of more? Perhaps as some information, we know that all the embassies have some programs, and we have some in Sweden to help the mobility of researchers, and especially Cotutelle PhD students. But surely, can we dream of something more during the agreement, or for this special PhD? Yes, Marjorie.
Maybe I could add, at the Franco-German University, we give the students 4,000 euros for this accommodation or for the mobility, and we reserve 1,000 euros for the traveling of the supervisors to the defense. And it is a point which has to be, in my opinion, discussed at first stage, if possible, between the universities or between the supervisors, because for example, in France, you can and you must have some external assessors by the jury at the defense, and for example, in Germany, you shouldn't have some. That's to say that in Germany, you wouldn't, as a university, then foresee that you have to pay something. And I think it's very important that the Institut Français or such institutions as ours made it possible to not only for the students, that's very, very important, but also for the supervisors or for the juror and for the assessors to come to the defense too.
Mathieu?
So maybe on this travel thing, indeed, the funding provided through in Sweden, for instance, works very, very well. We had to pay about €1,000, a bit more than €1,000 a year for traveling between France and Sweden, basically, for the 4 years of the PhD. This is what it costs. And on top of this, you have to add whatever you need to bring the jury in, which in terms of COVID is a bit easier, but for us, this costed a bit of money. We had one person coming from Canada, for instance. Just this explodes your budget when you're not expecting it. On the jury side, there is something funny, is that we did one defense with 2 juries, with more or less the same people in both, except that we had for the Swedish jury 2 researchers more than for the French one. The reason for it is simply that Sweden refused to validate the jury we had picked for the French side. The idea was to have exactly the same one, but Sweden decided that no, we couldn't have just these. And it worked quite well, but it will take, well decided for a jury in France takes maybe a month or something, and passing it through the administrative lines. When you start to have a cotutelle, plan a couple of months for this, just because stuff will happen. And we had to add these 2 extra members, like 3 weeks, barely 3 weeks before the defense, meaning that I just had time to ship the thesis, and they had to read it fast and come to Sweden.
Okay. I guess we addressed most of the questions, and there are some we didn't answer because they are asking. Some people are asking for partners, and I think we'll get to you a bit further and more specifically. Now, I think it should be time for all of you, maybe to tell us what would you be your take-home message today for all the attendees. I guess we could maybe start in the order of the intervention. So Hans, what would you tell us as take-home message?
Well, thank you. I think we have learned a lot about, I would guess, the challenges today. And we also seen some suggestions for solutions, how we can improve the collaborations in between our 2 countries when it comes to a double degree PhDs. But one thing I think we shouldn't forget about as well is that we can always do research exchanges within the normal PhD programs that we do have running in our both countries at the same time. So if you have good context in between different institutions, make sure to use them and to send our students to increase mobility in that way as well. It might not be as positively such a positive outcome as it was for Matthew here, but still you get the experience of being in an international environment. So,
thank you very much, Marjorie.
Yes, okay. There would be 2 points. 2 points I would underline, and the first of it is yes, it requires an effort from the higher education and from the different stakeholders from the higher education institution to put Cotutelle agreement on the good way, but it gives advantages as well for the students himself, as for the institution, as for the researchers, and for the institution. And if we succeeded in doing this with between France and Germany, you should succeed to doing this between France and Sweden. Maybe the other point is to stress and underline what Professor Adolfsson already said, and this is to stress maybe that on the that the Cotutelle has to be don't stay alone with your Cotutelle agreement. The best way is to involve the Cotutelle project in structured exchange between researchers, within a doctoral program, and within international exchanges. Thank you.
So, Carl, what would you say?
2 things. One of them is, of course, that the Cotutelle is a wonderful experience, as many interventions have shown. Of course, it may be a complicated path, and some of the issues have to be settled long in advance for it to make it easier for the student, because after all, it's for for him, that it's meant to be a wonderful experience. The second thing, more importantly, is that we definitely have to work closer with our Swedish colleagues, and for perhaps 3 reasons. One of them is that we are in a post-Brexit world, and that we need to strengthen our ties between the other European partners. The second one is that, as Ambassador, sorry, I forgot his name.
Etienne de Gonneville.
Ambassador Gonneville pointed out, well, there's a kind of background to the research and development objectives between Sweden and France. And so we might perhaps try and focus on these in particular, not necessarily on these only, but since there is a 2017 agreement, which I didn't know about, it might be worth our while to look into it for developing PhD, joint PhDs. And last but not least, why not set up a working group, hence, in order to solve a Franco-Swedish working group, in order to solve the issues which have been discussed and which are quite numerous. But, you know, someone just said how we need to solve issues mentioned above and in Q&A. So why not set up a joint working group? This might make things easier.
Thank you. Then we'll go on to Raymond.
Well, I think, as I tried to illustrate with my final slide, it's a bit of, you know, all parties involved, they need to be able to do a bit of acrobat stuff. It's not too difficult. It takes a while to set it up. My strong advice is to be open-minded, look at the 2 systems and pick the best of the 2 systems, the best from the student perspective, and it will work out fine. There are, of course, economical issues and so on, and perhaps there the French-Swedish association can think a little bit about if there could be a scheme from where sort of additional money could come in, like for travel costs, and also cover the cost of the double accommodation. Things like this, I think that would be perhaps interesting, and this could also maybe create, you know, some extra attention to this kind of double degree arrangements.
Thank you, Mathieu.
Yes, maybe two things as well, since it seems to be kind of a tradition now. The first thing is, like, there is many instruments to travel for researchers between France and Sweden, between basically any other countries. So meet people you want to start Cotutelle with, meet other researchers, and try to build a bond before you get a student in between. This would be the first one. And the second one is, like, the PhD is just the start of a career. So put the Cotutelle in a very broader context for the student. Discuss with the student about it and where they want to head. Because for some students, Cotutelle will be perfect. For others, it will not be the good thing to do. Maybe visits are easier. So discuss, maybe finally start to discuss the PhD as not an end, but the beginning of something. And for some students, this would help a lot.
Okay, and Beatrice?
Yes, I was thinking of when we started collaboration or our partnership with the KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, in 2012. We had similar problems when we set up like PhD programs, and so, but they are solvable when you're so stubborn and try to handle things. Maybe these obstacles they are bigger than we had, but I think when you break them down into small pieces, I think it works. You can work around all these issues. And I'm happy to hire all of you who get through the PhDs in the future. So keep in touch.
Okay, well then maybe, as we could see today, there is a great interest from the French side, but also from the Swedish side. And really, I think that's really great, because maybe there aren't many things existing, but there is apparently a will, and we will be here at disposal to the development of it. I would like to give this idea. We spoke of it yesterday, and Johan Putz is suggesting, of course, the PhD track possibility, make a French-Swedish master program to prepare a Cotutelle PhD. So I guess there is also a possibility. And well, I take for me the idea of working group, a French-Swedish one, to help getting further in solving the problems and issues. And well, just to all of you, thanks a lot. And we are at the disposal here in the Institut Français Sweden to help you find partners, solve problems, and working further on that topic. So many thanks to all of you, and we keep in touch. Have a nice day.
Bye then.
Bye.